is only infrastructure. And in short, then, I would say that the green spaces, they connect, yes, as effective carbon sinks. They are not the only possibility, but they have a lot of potential, again, depending on the context.
Important topic, green cities building sustainable urban futures. So today we are going to talk this topic, a wonderful topic. So before that, I would like to speak a little introduction about you, though a well-known name doesn't require thought, but a formality. Like yours is interdisciplinary academic background in environmental science, engineering, sustainable planning, and Ph.D. on urban decarbonization. Through nature-based solutions with practical experience across research, consulting, and international cooperation. And you are much more into academics and research also. So would like to cover this important topic, which I've already just mentioned, green cities building sustainable urban future. So thanks a lot, ma'am, joining us from Italy at this point of time, joining LISO. So would like to move on to my first question, which is certainly a very important question, says, what does sustainable urbanism mean in today's rapidly growing cities?
Well, yeah, before I answer this, I would like to thank you for the chance of participating at this conversation. I think every chance of having these topics in mind and seeing different approaches we can look at them is good. So without much more to say, I'd rather move into this interesting question you proposed. Well, I think the idea of sustainable urbanism is actually being used for a while now, so it's nothing that we can consider new. However, defining it in a sentence is kind of tricky. So I think first off, it's important to visualize this as nothing like a checklist of green initiatives or urban design trends, but maybe as something more complex in an involving framework, let's say. So the closest way I think I described what would be sustainable urbanism maybe would go towards this holistic approach. Meaning, it's not enough to focus solely on environmental performance. I think it's also very relevant to consider topics such as energy efficiency, carbon footprint that are for sure now a trend, but also points as well like the ecosystem of the city, how it functions, the infrastructure, connections, and of course the communities that live in the place, how they interact, and the governance aspect as well. When it comes, I think, to sustainable city, I believe that is a nice approach that is becoming more and more popular would be looking at it as a living organism. So if we have this approach, for example, you would see that there is an interdependence between the systems, all that you might be already aware of, such as transportation, housing, food, energy, waste, the social equity, all these points, they kind of relate and they demand some balance and, of course, a nice flow and work balance between all of them. And again, when it goes to the point of the supply chains, the economic engines, and how the informal networks are also present, this is all connected to the geopolitical system, so it's quite complex. That's why I was struggling. I thought, how do I answer this? And I don't want to go into a huge and broad word, but I think it's nice to have this in mind. And also, when it gets to the idea of what is the essence of truly being sustainable, probably it would be a dynamic that has this ongoing balance between the territory, the environment, people, and of course development. So if it's working in a health way, if these interconnections they are flowing respecting the other scopes, this tends to actually deliver, let's say, sectors interacting in a more synergetically way, reinforcing instead of undermining each other. So I don't know if I was able to answer, but I hope I could give you this holistic approach that I think is essential for us to have in mind when looking at a city instead of something that is only infrastructure and whenever it gets into a sustainable aspect that we should just put green there. It's kind of a bit more.
Thank you so much. You've given a very holistic explanation about it. rapidly growing cities and how sustainable urbanism mean and what it means today. So I would like to move on to my second question. Again, a very important question says, how can cities better integrate nature-based solutions into urban planning?
I think I'd say that the first step is recognizing the wide range of benefits that nature-based solutions can bring. So now we are living a very interesting moment because this is getting a lot of attention, and the idea of nature-based solutions is pretty much in the spotlight. But for a long time, cities were actually developing in a model that was prioritizing the transportation, vertical expansion, and the gray infrastructure. This led to a situation that is very common in different places, that you would see that nature was pushing out of the urban fabric. So the result was kind of a sense of disconnection between people and the nature environment, which turns to be complex again because this became a trend in different places and led to this separation between people and nature, when it's very interesting that we kind of belong to the system. So fortunately, this trend now is being reversed in different areas of the world, not only in Europe or America, but you can see this trend in Asia, South America. So let's say that over the past 30 years, especially, the environmental issues, they have gained a lot of global attention. And among them, the urban design has started to evolve in a greener direction, let's say. So there is this growing body of scientific evidence linking sustainable urban life with access to natural spaces and ecosystem services they provide. What began largely as an academic insight has now gradually moved into political agendas, governance frameworks, and planning practices. I say that in my view, while people have always felt this good connection with nature, in case of the green, for instance, seeking parks, riversides, natural relief within cities, this actually is more than an instinct. So finally, this is being supported by research and policy, public discourse. During my master's, I had the chance to do something very cool that is related to this topic. So then at the time, I was checking how elderly people were behaving, especially during warm days in Barcelona, and we were checking if they would, for example, go to green areas seeking for relief. And we found out that yes, so that the crucial it's really crucial that urban nature is not considered only as an abstract environmental sense, let's say, but also a real human and local place that welcome people in different circumstances. And of course, it ends up connecting to climate justice and more. So these nature areas, they are more than nature itself in a place. They have value, of course, per se, but they have much more to offer. And when it comes to an inclusive, interesting planning, they should start considering also people's needs and this connection between the communities, especially the vulnerable ones that eventually don't have the chance to have access to these areas and end up in a neglected situation, let's say. But to sum up and close the question, I think to address this, involving the private sector more often would also make it perhaps easier to flow and to develop, because through different studies we can see sometimes that public and private partnerships are a promising path for promoting the nature-based solutions, and they can bring this funding, innovation, and long-term maintenance strategies that sometimes are hard to keep when it comes to the public area only. So at the end, this helps. I would say that the stakeholders involved in the process, they are a nice way of pushing, meaning community, the private sector, and the public, in order to have this socially and economically, let's say, feasible. And when urban design is considered the potential for mutual benefit, it's quite productive. So then it's just a way of combining forces to achieve this type of development and green infrastructure.
Thank you so much for responding this important question and like integrating nature-based solutions into urban planning. Your explanation is certainly wonderful. Would like to move on to my third question. Important question says, in what ways do green spaces act as effective carbon sinks.
Yeah, this is actually the main topic of my ongoing PhD research. So maybe in about a year, I'll be able to answer this better. But for now, I think I can share a few things. For example, based on what I've been doing so far in trying to quantify carbon, it's tricky because it's essential for us to distinguish, for example, between a few concepts in terms of climate change mitigation. We have emissions avoided, carbon captured, and carbon stored. And they look similar and the same sometimes, but they are slightly different. They represent different strategies. So preventing emissions from occurring in the first place would be the best, but then we have alternatives such as capturing emissions that are already in progress or even storing in the long term, especially through nature systems when it comes to my area at least. So I'd say that these greenscapes, they relate to the three, but depending on how they are planned and managed, they will be delivering one or another benefit when it comes to design, let's say. Thinking about the carbon capture, that is the one that I've been most in contact with, and the storage especially, the sinks in the urban context, they vary. So carbon sink potential of different nature-based solutions, they will vary. And this is also depending and very connected to what would be the land use and land cover. So it's hard to talk about anything in this sense without considering governance and the local planning, which is very unique depending on the context. That means that looking at land tenure systems, local governments, zoning laws, and even informal rules and social norms that influence land access is going to influence a lot in the transformation process. Without this understanding, it's going to be hard. Integrating effective green spaces is difficult and, depending on the case, even impossible. So every city will have its own set of challenges and its set of rules: cultural, demographic, social, political, economic, and more. And that's why sometimes it's really complicated to provide a formula or something that can be replicated in different areas. Like in my research, I decided to get 10 different case studies from different parts of the world to have a reference of what's going on in the continents here and there. And this just proved that the design is actually very unique and will be needed a lot of local research and feasibility studies to understand how to understand the potential, but also to provide best strategies. So the frameworks are starting to emerge in different parts, and you can see this conversation happening in many areas. But we do need to understand, for example, to have a better solution, the availability of resources of a problem. So you need to consider financial, ecological, spatial, institutional, and in any case, in any project, to define clear goals is also important to have acquainted the local situation and how they are counting emissions. So it's something that you can. I am now in a PhD, but it could be also a postdoc and more. And anyways, these can evolve into different approaches, but to try to move towards an answer instead of divaguing too much, I think a few things they can provide better input, better conditions for absorption, such as you can have species selection, choosing, if talking about the green space, for example, we can work preferably with native vegetation, trying to consider what is going to be more feasible to maintain for long-term governance, again, considering as well tenure security as the initial steps of an implementation. And another thing that can be also very productive in the sense for making important choices and wise choices is modeling. So there are different tools nowadays, some that are including very intuitive in a way or even free, and by simulating the scenarios, the planners, they can better understand the potential of the specific interventions in terms of carbon sequestration and eventually even co-benefits, because sometimes you can have extra benefits as well, such as thermal balance and more. And in short, then, I would say that the green spaces, they connect, yes, as effective carbon sinks. They are not the only possibility, but they have a lot of potential again, depending on the context and considering the variables of a specific local before making any choice or any planning.
So much for letting us know like Spaces Act has effective carbon sinks, wonderful narrative and very much detail. Would like to move on to my fourth question. A very important question says, can you share an example of a city successfully using natural infrastructure for sustainability?
Yeah, actually, there are many cities nowadays that are increasingly integrating natural infrastructure in their planning strategies. I would say that, yes, while in Europe, for example, there is a leading way, but we can see this as well in other places, promising advances. I would say in Asia, South America, for instance. So we have many nice examples. However, I think one nice and strong example, and I know a little bit more so I can share and be sure about what I'm talking about, is in Europe. So I will take Barcelona as a good example. Barcelona in Spain. I like this one in particular because I spent some time there when I was doing my master's, and also I had the chance to investigate how they develop the planning. So it's great the way they work. They have this combination about what is going to be applied for citizen well-being, considering as well an inclusive and evidence approach. So there is this interesting balance between academic information, but also aiming at offering a very inclusive city and sustainable in different aspects. In this case, I think it's a nice example would be the climate shelters they are now developing there. Those I had some connection and involvement in. So pretty much the climate shelters, they are about using the nature spaces to invite people who are above all in vulnerable circumstances and, for example, would not have an air conditioning at home during the summer. Before, of course, you already had some green spaces there, but they have now not only improved the areas so they are more attractive, but also they've tried to spread these spaces through the city with the signs of climate shelters for locals to be invited to go there in warm days. This is nice for several points of view. I think using better the space, of course, has its own advantage and it's great, but also having in mind that a few people that are not able to have thermal comfort at home now have the chance and the incentive to have a little bit more of quality of life, even though through a simple strategy, is great. Not only this, but I think this was a nice beginning. They have also developed different strategies when it comes to transportation, and it's also very interesting the way they are approaching the transition in terms of energy. The planning has this approach of actively listening to citizens and having them involved in the attitudes and the implementation, so this collaborates to the solutions being welcome as well and understanding what people really want. In parallel, I think there is this huge movement towards using more and more public transportation, bicycles, walking. So it has this complete planning that I appreciate very much. And then, last but not least, I think it's a very inspiring place because they keep valuing beauty, art, and the infrastructure reflects this beautiful idea of trying to allow spaces to offer their functionality, but also while being practical, keeping different ideas in mind and then delivering this proper investment, good governance and willingness to innovate, but also with the living examples and sustainability, but that has above all the quality of life in mind and not only the infrastructure per se, but the combination of all the scopes I've been mentioning.
So much you also explained and you've spoken about climate shelter, engaging and indulging local people and seeing their perception in expanding their horizon and their involvement. That's what I understand. Would like to move on to my fifth question, which is also a wrap up and final question. Very important question says, what are the biggest challenges in expanding urban green areas today?
There are some. I think one of the biggest challenges is definitely the combination of financing and finding the right strategies for implementation, especially if the goal is to create green areas that are inclusive, equitable, and that are genuinely beneficial for the wider public. It's not just about planting trees, and I think this point of creating spaces but having these climate justice in mind is extremely important. Point is that eventually the transformation of neighborhoods in ways that are not properly planned can eventually have what some call like maladaptation, because depending on the way the process is developed, it happens that a project is supposed to deliver environmental or social benefits but ends up creating other problems, such as what is happening in different areas now. You have the introduction of non-native species in a few areas that they create problems for biodiversity, or in other moments there is also the strain local water resources and many other problems. Above all, I think one that comes up very often is also now I forgot the name. I will remember soon. But I think the idea behind is that whenever you are developing a project, you ended up sometimes creating gentrification. I remember this. You end up creating what we call gentrification. And this is basically the problem that happens of getting prices to increase due to improvement in the infrastructure. Living there by making everything much more expensive. So in many ways, whenever there is a planning going on, whenever we have dense populated cities, it's important to start as well considering the points that we slightly touched today. Zoning laws, building regulations, sometimes these things, they might take time and they might be a bit bureaucratic depending on the place, but they are extremely important to start addressing the challenges that are nowadays in progress. And of course, having any decision with scientific based information and combining different stakeholders and interests in order to have higher acceptance, different points of view, and also, depending on the situation, a way of providing economic improvement for those involved is also interesting. I'd say that another point is that in order to avoid these pitfalls, some measures can help, like feasibility studies, technical assessments, the one I mentioned before, the policy alignment, and of course, working not only considering the urban plannings and designers, but also people who can really represent locals and tell us what they want, because there is a chance that the perception of those who are not from a place will be different from those who are. So having all of this in mind tends to help. And even though, again, the political context, the coordination between departments might be complex and complicated, it's necessary to have an integrated urban governance. And in other words, expanding these urban areas, these places, is far from simple. So it demands cross-sector collaboration and a lot of patience and love, because those who are in this type of work like me, I think the main motivation is always trying to find the balance between people, nature, and the financial challenges that are behind any project. But at the end of the day, it's worth it. I could be here listing challenges, but I try to be goal and solution oriented. So that's why I was trying to list and bring here some ideas of how complex things might be, but what points we can have in mind when trying to understand what's behind sustainable urban planning, and also what can really work in a slightly more practical way. So I hope I was able to share a little.
Thank you so much, ma'am, giving your time. You've talked wonderful stuff, and important topic you've covered: green cities, building sustainable urban future. You've talked about sustainable urbanism, means like rapidly growing cities, and cities better integrate nature-based solutions. You've talked about, and ways to green spaces, effective carbon sinks, and examples. You've also successful cities in given and biggest challenge is expanding urban green areas today. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again for that. So as you're already familiar that resource is a platform where we try to step through the noise to cause you most relevant sociological and authentic sociological explanations on different domains and topics. We try to cover different topics such as, environmental concerns, disaster management, human rights, trafficking, gender-based things, developmental issues we try to cover to make the society more better and more possibility with. So once again, ma'am, thank you so much joining us from Italy and appearing on the platform of this. Thank you so much.